All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. Hope you enjoyed. You have a real treat of a presentation up next, all about Confluence, which I know is a lot of your favorite products. But we have Casper Krieger here. He's a senior development team lead for Status Page, which is the team I'm on too. So extra fun to get to be his track lead for this. Casper is a longtime Atlassian. He has been at the company for a little over 5.5 years, and he's definitely a subject matter expert when it comes to Confluence. At one time, he was the top 5 commenters of all people on our Confluence instance, and that's a lot. He also ballroom dances in his spare time, so you might have to find him at Bash later and hold him to that. All right, without further ado, Casper.
Thank you, Shannon. In 2010, I was working at a globally distributed mega corporation. And when I mean a globally distributed mega corporation, I mean a company with over 100,000 people worldwide. So needless to say, they relied heavily on email to do their work. The email client that I had the interesting experience of using at the time was called Lotus Notes. And Lotus Notes is an unusual email client because it's actually a distributed document store first and an email client second. The upside of this is that you can use Lotus Notes to do things like distributed bug tracking and keeping track of your IT assets without having to run a completely separate server. The downside of this is that your email experience is also built on the same distributed document store technology. And that leads to some incredibly weird interactions. One day, I was working with my boss, a hardworking man called Kenny, to run a promotion to increase our graduate recruiting efforts. And he had just asked me for the latest figures on how it was going. So of course, I looked them up in our online tool, and I told them to him, because he was my boss after all. And I was really expecting him to send them off in an email immediately, or something like that. And what he did next actually surprised me. He did open up Lotus Notes, but instead of replying to an email or composing a completely new email, he found the last email that he had received on the topic, and then he hit the edit button. And then he edited the information that I just told him into that email that he had already received. And then he hit the save button. And I watched him do this, and I scratched my head for a couple of seconds before I was like, oh, I get it. What's going on here is that he's edited the email, and the email is built on the distributed document store model of Lotus Notes. So what's going to happen is it's going to synchronize across everybody who's been part of that conversation. And I was like, oh, wow, that's super neat. So I told him, hey, Kenny, thanks for showing me that neat trick. It's really cool. And he says, what trick? What are you talking about? I said, you know, the thing where you edit the email and then all of a sudden everybody's going to get it and it's just all going to make sense because they don't even have to receive a new email. It's like an automatically updated knowledge base thing. And he's like, what? That's not how email works, you dummy. Come on, you know how email works. You've been working here a long time. And what he had done was almost the same thing as sending himself an email. He just knew that email was how he kept his notes to himself. And it was basically like just a note-taking mechanism for him. So although this was couched in a really weird way in the use of Lotus Notes, to me, it showed a bigger lesson about how our company operated. Our company had an email-driven culture, and there were some key problems with that, and this was the first one that I had just seen. Although the information that Kenny had just gotten from me could have been widely useful to people outside of our immediate team immediately, it was instead locked up in his inbox until he chose to release it to people. And if Kenny would ever leave that company, then all of a sudden, all the information in his inbox would be lost as well. There were other problems as well. In our company, we had a lot of irrelevant broadcasts going out via email, and irrelevant broadcasts in email mean irrelevant discussions that follow. Once you're on someone's CC list, you can't take them off. And the opposite problem also happened. I would be having conversations with multiple people, and inevitably, somebody forgets to hit reply all, and then all of a sudden, people are getting left out of the conversation. Who's listening to this and thinking, yep, these problems are sounding real familiar? Yeah, looks like most of you. Okay, cool. You're in the right place. Today, I'm here to talk to you about how you can solve these problems and more important problems than these through effective use of Confluence. In particular, as Shannon told you, I'm not on the Confluence team. I'm not going to tell you some story about how the latest feature we just implemented is going to triple your productivity. Instead, I'm going to give you real lessons from the front lines of getting things done at Confluence over the past 5 years at Atlassian. And spoiler alert, the features to do this have been available for years. As we go, I'll share key tips and tactics that you can apply immediately in your organization, and I'll take your questions at the end. So let's review the problems real quickly. Information gets locked up in inboxes where it stays until it's released by people. There's no easy way to opt out of conversations that you're not interested in, and people inevitably forget to reply all, so you get left out of conversations. So how does Confluence solve these problems? Because obviously Confluence does solve these problems, otherwise you wouldn't be here listening to me talk about them in a talk about Confluence, right? And actually the answer to that is pretty straightforward. You can read about how Confluence solves these problems on our website. Our website will tell you, in Confluence, knowledge is preserved because Confluence pages store everything forever. And it's true. I can go back and I can read the original plan specifications, design decisions, and roadmaps for our initial cloud offerings over 10 years ago at Atlassian. They're all still there. And some of those decisions that we made back then are still relevant today. So it's very useful to have that context. Secondly, in Confluence, conversation moves from email conversations to comments on a page. And comments on a page mean that you can opt out of a conversation just by stopping from watching that page. Easy unsubscribe, problem solved. And the opposite problem doesn't even happen. Because conversation has already moved to comments on a page, there's no reply all versus reply distinction. It's always reply all. People never get left out of the conversation. And it's easy to catch up on a conversation as well. You automatically get looped in just by reading the comments on a Confluence page. So that solves all the problems of email. Don't you guys can all disappear, right? Why am I still here talking to you? It's because what we don't tell you on our marketing website is that once you introduce Confluence into your organization, you now have a new problem. Either you've adopted Confluence and nobody is using it, which I'll talk a little bit about later in my talk, or you've adopted Confluence and people have really adopted Confluence. They've made so much content all over the place that it's just gotten really messy, and you just can't help but feel like there's inefficiencies. There's got to be a better way to get things done. How can we clean up this mess of content all over the place? What do I mean by messy content? Just make sure we're on the same page here. Come on. So the key item of content in Confluence is a page, and a page is organized in a hierarchical structure. Hierarchical structure meaning there's parents and child pages and sibling pages, and pages are contained in spaces. So spaces in Confluence are nothing more than containers of pages. If you use Confluence the way that Atlassian recommends that you use it, the way that we use it ourselves, you'll have one space per team. So for example, Team Rocket has a space and Team Pac-Man has a space. And if you have shared concerns like working groups that cross multiple teams, then you have a space for those working groups as well. So in this case, Team Rocket and Team Pac-Man are both interested in locomotion, so there's a locomotion space as well. Now, knowing that Confluence is divided up into pages which live in spaces, the easiest way to slice the problem of trying to deal with the messiness is to think about how do we organize the content in a space first. So how does Atlassian deal with that? Well, I've got some bad news for you. The problem is that work is fundamentally messy. You can't order everything, and you shouldn't try to. You want your teams to be focused on getting shit done, not competing to have the best groomed Confluence spaces. So instead of trying to solve the problem, you need to shift your mindset to trying to stem the tide of the mess. So here are 3 key tactics that Atlassian uses to keep the chaos at bay. The first key tactic is to have a good space homepage. Now, every Confluence space has a homepage by default. It's the page that you land on when you first navigate to a space. But also by default, the content on that space isn't particularly useful. So what you need to do is you need to edit it to include useful information like links to team goals, roadmaps, current plans, current team members, that kind of thing. And it also helps to add links to secondary index pages. These might be pages such as lists of previous meeting notes, lists of past projects. These secondary index pages will help you navigate deeper into the hierarchy of pages in your Confluence space. Above all, you need to keep your Confluence homepage relatively simple, functional, and utilitarian. The details of your Confluence space are for the people working in the space, so there's no need to add illustrations or pretty it up or anything like that. Keep it for the team working on it. The second tactic that we use is the principle of most privilege. Now, a couple of you might be reading this and thinking, that's actually wrong. It should be the principle of least privilege, because that's how most companies operate. They operate on the principle of a need-to-know mindset. Give someone access to something only if they very specifically need that access. But Atlassian operates on the opposite principle, the principle of most privilege. And that means that unless there's a very specific reason to not give someone access to a page, you should give them access to it. Have you ever wondered why when you create a page in Confluence, it's open by default? Everybody can edit it, everybody can see it. That's because we're trying to encourage you to use Confluence the way that we use it. But this doesn't just apply to viewing and editing pages. It also applies to creating pages in your own space and in other spaces. And it applies to creating spaces as well. Everybody should have access to create a space. What if someone wants to create a new working group initiative? Shouldn't they be able to do that? Of course they should. But most importantly, this principle is key for the next tactic, which is you need to encourage your users of Confluence to fix what is broken, especially for problems that they don't own. In Atlassian, we consider a rite of passage to fix mistakes in our co-founders' pages. Once you've fixed a mistake in Mike or Scott's page, that's how you know that you've really made it as an Atlassian. And a really good way to get started in your company with this is to update your onboarding material to have new hires fix mistakes in it as they go along. All right, 3 key tactics which will organize the content in your space. And you've probably heard me say these and talk you through them, and then you're thinking, okay, that first one, that's pretty easy. I can add some links to a page, there's no problem, right? But the second and third ones, they sound a lot harder. What if you have security people telling you you can't just open things up, you've got to lock things down? What about if you're worried about people stealing company secrets? What if you've got security people worried about people stealing company secrets? How do you deal with those kinds of objections? And the answer lies in your company values. And let me give you an example using Atlassian's values. In Atlassian, we rely very strongly on 2 key values when it comes to working with Confluence. And those two key values are open company, no bullshit, and be the change you seek. Open company, no bullshit is very important because you can't have a company that's open unless people can access each other's pages and see each other's work. So it aligns very closely to the principle of most privilege. Be the change you seek is all about being the change that you wish to see in the world. So molding the world into your image. And that maps directly to fixing what is broken, because who wants to work with a Confluence that is all messed up and over the place and has a whole bunch of mistakes everywhere? People want to fix what is broken when they're being the change they seek. So those 2 key values align nicely to the ways that we think Confluence should be used. But what I want to point out is that the ideas behind these values are very general. We take our values seriously, but what you should do is figure out how you can rephrase your company's values to match the principle of most privilege and fix what is broken. And what I mean by that is that your company's values probably have some words in them, like trust, responsibility, collaboration, and teamwork. And those are words that you can use to justify the use of Confluence in the way that it's intended to be used by Atlassian. Let me give you an example. If your company value is teamwork through responsibility, what have we got to work with there? Well, you've got teamwork, okay. People can't work together if they don't have access to everything, right? So that's justification for the principle of most privilege. What about responsibility? Well, it's not really responsibility if everything is locked down so much, and if you don't even trust your people to not sell secrets to company competitors, how is that endowing them with a sense of responsibility? It's like children locking them up in a straitjacket, right? It's a very different thing. So the key thing here is that your company's leadership and the people in your company have come up with this set of company values, which ostensibly at least, they're intending their company to live by. And if your security person or other person who is objecting to your use of Confluence is not willing to stand in line with those values, then you can point them at those values and you can say, sorry, but what you're saying is against how the company is intending to operate. All right, so that's how you organize content within a space. How do you organize spaces together? Atlassian has over 6,000 Confluence spaces in its Confluence instance. It's more than 2 spaces per employee. Wow. So you might think that that's why we introduced space categories and space tags, right? That's going to solve that problem really handily. But the fact is that Atlassian barely uses those features of Confluence. And it's not because it's a pain in the ass to use them. I'll tell you why with a metaphor. Your Confluence is like this salad. This salad is a mess, but there's value in it because it tastes good. And likewise, your Confluence is a mess, but there's value in it because each space contains the hard work of your teams. So what would happen if Atlassian marshaled together a team of, let's say, 5 people for 3 to 4 weeks and defined a consistent taxonomy, a clear way to order every single space and page and all kinds of that? Let's imply a very clear ordering and impose that upon our Confluence. What would that do? This is what happens to a salad when you carefully organize it. You took a delicious salad and you turned it into a bunch of boring ingredients on a chopping board. You meant to take a step forward, but instead you've taken a step back. And the same thing applies to Confluence. If you try to impose order on the use of Confluence, then what will actually happen is that you'll inhibit the use of Confluence, because remember, work is fundamentally messy and you can't neatly categorize it away and put it into a box. And that poses a problem, because remember, we had this instinct that something was wrong with the way that we were using Confluence. We had this content and it was messy, and if imposing order on it isn't the problem, then how do we fix that? Well, our instincts were telling us something else, actually. They were talking about how it's a problem, that our spaces weren't really connected perhaps, that there was this work going on in various disparate places, but we weren't really taking full advantage of what we could be taking advantage of. I think what we really want to solve when it comes to using Confluence properly is that we want our teams to talk to each other. That's the real problem that many people have been trying to solve with many tools and many collaborative solutions and technologies all along. In fact, you remember those 3 problems I talked about at the very start of my talk? The 3 problems with email. They're just surface problems. I mean, sure, they're annoying, but they don't actually actively stop you from getting your work done. Having teams not talk to each other is a much larger problem. And it applies to email, because email is a terrible broadcast mechanism. You either get to choose, you get all the information spammed at you, or you get no information, so that's a terrible choice. But unfortunately, the same problem applies to Confluence as well. By default, in Confluence, you have everybody doing good work in their own spaces inside Confluence, but they're in these little bubbles and they're not building on each other's work. They're reinventing their own solutions instead of standing on each other's shoulders. What you need is some way of connecting them together, some form of connective tissue without imposing order on them, because again, we've already tried that, it's not going to work. In Confluence terms, you've got good work being done in individual spaces, but you need a way for people to find that work in other teams' spaces, organically. And in Atlassian, the solution for that connective tissue is blog posts. Blog posts allow teams to organically discover work in each other's spaces and bind together the work across multiple different teams in Atlassian. In fact, we published over 6,500 blog posts just in the last year across Atlassian. That's 25 blog posts a day. And that's a lot more than most of our customers publish. And I think it might be because most people don't know what blog posts even are. Why use a blog post versus a page? And what is this guy talking about, right? So I want to give a quick example so that you guys know what's going on. Here's a page in Pac-Man space. And what makes this page a page in Confluence context? Well, I've already told you that it's part of a space, and that's one thing that makes it a page. But the other thing that makes it a page is that it has this hierarchical structure associated with it. It has siblings, it has a parent, and it might have children. This one doesn't, but it could. Now, what if we tried something different? Instead of thinking about where a page is in a space, let's think about when it was published. What if we introduced a chronological timeline and laid out content according to that? And that's all that blog posts really are. Blog posts are a page which is situated when in a space rather than situated where in a space. And what this means is that because you don't have the extra detail of the hierarchical nesting structure that exists for pages, you can't go into detail on a blog post. It doesn't fit the medium. You end up with blog posts being an easily digestible view of what's going on in a space. And as a result, reading a list of blog posts in a space is like reading a history book or a news feed of what's going on with a particular team. And because they're so much easier to digest than the raw content that's in the team's pages, that's how teams in other teams can figure out what a team is working on and share their information and their content. And this works because each blog post is going to link back to the pages in the individual space that that team is working on in. So let's give you an example. The Jira team might be working on improving performance. And when they're done improving their performance, they'll publish a victory post, right? They're going to say, look, we improved performance by X%, because the Jira team is very talented. They're going to succeed, of course. And they'll publish maybe the 3 top wins in their Confluence blog post. And as a result of doing that, people learn about 3 new ways that they can improve their Java applications. But what they haven't talked about in their blog post, but are likely to make strong references to, is all the failed approaches that they took. The performance testing methodologies that they used, the load testing methodologies, the smaller wins that didn't make it into the blog post because they weren't noteworthy enough. And all that will be detailed in the pages of their space. And the blog post will link back to reference pages where other people who are interested in reading this from other teams can find those details and they can build on that information. So that's how my team can benefit from Jira's performance work. And this is how the connective tissue works. And it gets better than that. Because blog posts don't just link to pages in their own space. They also link to blog posts and space and pages in other spaces. And what happens as a result of this is that there's an amplification effect. The Jira team might not have been the first one to work on performance. Maybe the Confluence team beat them to the punch. And so if the Confluence team has written a blog post on performance, but my team, the status page team, didn't actually see that at the time, and we see the Jira blog post, well, the Jira blog post is probably going to refer back to the Confluence blog post, which means there's a backup chance, there's a second chance for us to find the information that Confluence had published. And so this causes good ideas to spread throughout the organization like wildfire. Blog post links to blog post links to blog post, and there's this chain of history about why ideas are good and how they work. So I'm hoping that you can all start to see some of the benefits of blog posts when you adopt them inside your organization. But communicating via blog posts also has some unique advantages that really aren't as obvious as these kind of mechanical intricacies of how they kind of work. And I want to tell you a story about some of those now, because it took me a couple of years to figure this out. 2 years ago, I was working in Atlassian's identity department, and we were working on transforming Atlassian's monolithic set of services into a new microservice future. In fact, the specification called for rather a lot of microservices. Too many, in fact. The architects hadn't taken into account the fixed cost associated with creating every new service. And as a result, the project was due to run over budget. Now I tried to talk to them and to get them to decrease the amount of services, but they weren't really respecting my arguments. So I wrote a blog post, and in it I detailed the cost of spinning up a new service based on my team's experiences over the past quarter. And then I shared it with my colleagues and coworkers, and I got a lot of support in the form of comments and likes. I got so much support, I was able to convince the architects to simplify their design at the cost of some architectural purity. Now, the blog post helped me get the job done here, but that's not the point of the story. This is a day in the life of an Atlassian engineer. You make some compromises, some trade-offs, and you get the job done on schedule in this case. What was decidedly unusual, though, was this thank you note that crossed my desk the next quarter. This thank you note came from the head of infrastructure at Atlassian, and his job as an engineering manager was to make it faster for teams at Atlassian to create new services. And this thank you note read, "Hey Casper, your post on creating a new service was basically a backlog for half of infrastructure's work over the next year. Thank you very much. Much appreciated, JC." Well, I wasn't expecting that. I had barely even met JC. He was sort of at the level of my boss's boss or boss's boss's boss, and he wasn't even in my reporting chain. But because I had written my blog post up and it had gotten a lot of support in the form of comments and likes, he had found it and he had used that as justification for investing in this problem area in Atlassian. So I, as a ground floor problem solver, was able to influence my leadership team, not even my leadership team, Atlassian's broader leadership team, to invest in problem areas. But Confluence isn't just useful for communicating upwards like that. Confluence also works for communicating down with blog posts, although maybe not in the way that you exactly think. Like most modern companies, Atlassian relies heavily on using mobile phones to allow its employees to get work done on the go. Unlike most companies of over 1,000 employees, Atlassian took a very long time to institute a bring-your-own-device policy. And in fact, when we had a new head of IT join a couple of years ago, then he was a little bit concerned that we didn't have a bring-your-own-device policy. So he took his team, he was eager to make a mark, so he took his team away and decided, look, let's put this together. So he drafted it on a Confluence page, multiple Confluence pages. He consulted with industry partners to see what was current best practices. And then he published a blog post to communicate to the rest of the organization, this is the new policy and this is the impact of the policy. And the thing is, it didn't really work. You'd think that would work. That's almost the playbook of how you carefully use Confluence to collaborate and get things done. But the problem is he hadn't thought of it as a collaboration tool. He had thought of this as a communication tool. And so what happened when he actually published his blog post, was that people had a huge outrage. Everyone was in uproar. People were like, what is this crap new policy? It's going to invade our privacy. It's going to hurt our mobile developers. See, he had mistaken Confluence for a communication tool, when in fact, it's actually a collaboration tool. To his credit, he took that feedback on board, and he went back and drafted a new version 2 of the policy. But he didn't just do it alone with his team this time. He actually invited the loudest commenters on that blog post to come and draft the next version of the policy with him. And guess what happened when he published the version 2 blog post? The reception was obviously a lot better. The end product was a lot better. But most importantly, he had turned his biggest opponents into his biggest proponents by allowing them the chance to weigh in. And so the real moral of this story is not that complaining about a policy that you don't like is a good way to get it changed, although, yeah, obviously that worked in this case. The moral of the story is that by communicating via blog posts, it ends up being a collaboration tool. Communicating via blog posts allows people a chance to weigh in on your new ideas. And by giving them a chance to weigh in, you give them a chance to buy in. And of course, as a bonus, you get a better end result. Being able to weigh in on new ideas has actually been identified as a really important concept for highly performing teams. Who here has heard of Project Aristotle? Looks like 1, 2, maybe 3 or 4 of you. Okay, Project Aristotle was a study run by Google from 2012 to 2015. And in it, they studied over 180 teams to identify what makes a team effective at Google and what makes some teams flounder. And what they found was 5 key traits which were shared by all highly effective teams. Traits like needing to feel like your work has meaning in the team. But the most important thing that they rediscovered was this idea of psychological safety. In fact, Google's data indicated that psychological safety, more than anything else, was critical to making a team work. Psychological safety is the feeling that it is safe to take risks in the team, that team members have each other's back. In fact, if you follow the quote in that, if you follow that article that's up behind me, then there's a really good story in there which shows that psychological safety is built by bringing your whole self to work. And I don't have time to tell it now, but I encourage you to read the article. What does bringing your whole self to work have to do with using Confluence? Well, it's got to do with your Confluence spaces. Remember these guys. So I told you teams have spaces and working groups have spaces, but I didn't tell you the whole story. Because actually, I have a space in Confluence as well. I have a personal space, and so does the rest of my team, and so does everybody at Atlassian. And in your personal space, you can write growth plans and notes and project ideas, but you can also write blog posts. And it turns out that in Atlassian, blog posts are a key way for Atlassian employees to connect with each other as human beings, rather than faceless automatons working for a corporate machine. When people go on holiday, they post pictures of their holiday destinations. When people get new puppies, they post pictures of their puppies. When people get married, they post pictures of their wedding. This was me getting married last year. Well, actually, I lied a little bit. The focus of my wedding blog post was actually the wedding cake I made, because it's all made of Lego, and every Lego piece is edible. It was a hell of a lot of work, but I really wanted to share this with my colleagues. But blog posts aren't just for happy days. They're also for when the going gets tough. Just 2 months ago, an Atlassian employee published a blog post about a very difficult topic. We use it to open up about topics like discrimination and mental health. And she wrote about a blog post titled, "Why I'm Not Going to Summit This Year." And in it, she detailed that the stress of preparing for her summit talk had caused her mental health to suffer. She was starting to get anxiety attacks and not sleeping well. Although her withdrawal from Summit caused the Summit team to have to scramble to find a replacement, she received an absolute outpouring of support from the Atlassian community. Each of those people felt privileged and trusted that she had trusted them enough to open up and be vulnerable to them. And as a result, they felt an increased connection to her. And that's how you build psychological safety in your teams through personal blog posts. They provide an opportunity to build empathy and trust by connecting as human beings, and that in turn builds psychological safety, which results in higher performing teams. These three kind of obscure benefits of Confluence blog posts, as well as the mechanical benefits of allowing teams to connect with each other and build upon each other's work in different spaces, are so strong that Atlassian has an unwritten golden rule. And that golden rule is always write blog posts and never write announcement emails. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Every time that you're about to send an email to a mailing list, instead of doing that, open up Confluence, write a blog post, publish the blog post, and then use Confluence's shared dialogue. I'll give you guys a sec to finish your photos. Use Confluence's shared dialogue to share that blog post to the exact same mailing list. By doing this, you unlock the benefits of Confluence immediately for your team. Now you're probably thinking, haha, gotcha, now you're sending emails again. And you're right, but it's fewer emails than I was getting back in 2010, so I still consider it a win. You're probably also thinking, writing blog posts is all well and good, but it's kind of scary, you know? And it is. At Atlassian, we have almost 3,000 employees, and penning something that could be read by all of them is kind of intimidating. How do we get people over that initial hump, that hurdle? Well, what we do is we use a tradition called introductory blog posts, or intro blogs. Intro blogs are something that everybody has to write when they join Atlassian, and usually when they change teams as well. And in it, they detail what team they're joining, where they came from, what's their favorite shade of blue, what's the name of their pets, anything they really want. People like to have a lot of fun with them, you know? Some people write executable code, and some people write poetry of dubious quality by their own admission. Some people talk about the pros and cons of raising cows, you know, pros, they help pay for college. And cons, milking cows at 4 a.m. is awful, and washing them at 5 a.m. is super awful. My favorite blog post is this film noir style one. And if you scroll down to the bottom of it, it even has this report with like this fake coffee stain on the bottom. You know, people put in a lot of effort, you know. But even if you don't put in a lot of effort, writing an introductory blog post, which you share with the members of the team you're about to join, is about as low pressure as a blog post can be. And once you've done it, the second blog post that you're likely to write, probably for work purposes, is going to be a lot easier because you've already crossed that hurdle. The final thing I want to point out about this tradition is that it's not optional. It's mandatory. It's in everybody's onboarding plan, and managers follow up. If you don't do it, people notice, and they tease you about it. So the social pressure is high. And that's a key takeaway that you should follow for your own company. You should add intro blog posts to your own team or department's onboarding plan. It will get people started off on the right foot and encourage the blogging culture in your team. So what do you do when people don't really follow the norms that you've established via intro blog posts and the golden rule, the unwritten rule? What do you do when you receive an email that really should have been a blog post that's been shared with you? Well, the key is to gently let them know that they made a mistake without making any enemies. So to do that, you draft an email, because they just sent an email to you, so it makes sense. And in your email, you need to always refer back to the benefits of using Confluence rather than turning it into, you stuffed up, we do it this way. Okay? And the reason you want to do that is because if you talk about the benefits of Confluence, it changes the tone of the email entirely. Let me give you an example. Let's say someone just published an announcement email, sent an announcement email, saying, hey, we beat our quarter's goals expectations, good work, team. And then you should reply to them and say, look, by sending that as an email instead of publishing it as a blog post, you've robbed your team of shared celebration opportunity. They could be celebrating via comments on that Confluence blog post. They could be all happy instead of spamming each other via email, which is likely to discourage them from celebrating in the first place. And if somebody publishes an announcement, which is likely to generate some questions, point out how if they published it as a blog post, then they wouldn't have to answer questions multiple times. You refer back to the benefits of Confluence, and it makes it about giving them a tip on how to work more effectively, instead of slapping them on the wrist, which people don't appreciate. And as with most teaching opportunities, it works best when it's one-on-one, so don't hit reply all. If you hit reply all, you sound like a vengeful person trying to take revenge for spamming your inbox. Now, if you've been following along so far, you'll notice that we publish about 25 blog posts a day at Atlassian, but only 5 of them actually get shared into your inbox. So how do the remaining 20 blog posts a day actually get read? And the answer lies in your Confluence notification settings, and I'll see if you can spot the notification setting that matters. Well, the fact that it's kind of not obvious is probably part of the problem here. It's probably why people don't use blog posts as much as they should. It's this setting right here. And when you turn this on, you will receive an email about every single blog post that has ever been published in Confluence. Well, sorry, as it gets published in Confluence. And I want to be clear that when you turn this on, and your company has adopted blog posts as Atlassian has, then it's like a superpower. You will, in the space of about 3 to 6 months, become the most informed person at your company. And you thought you've caught me out again, right? You're thinking, if I turn this on, I'm going to receive 25 emails a day. There's always a catch, isn't there? You always come back to email. But the trick is that not everybody has to turn that setting on in order for Confluence to work for your organization. In Atlassian, a company of almost 3,000 employees, maybe 100, maybe 200 people have that setting actually turned on. But they perform a crucial role. And that role is that they scale Confluence, and they do this in 2 ways. The first is that they determine what ends up on the popular feed. Some of you probably know that Confluence has a dashboard, and in that dashboard it shows the popular pages and blog posts. And the things that end up on there are determined by how many comments and likes they received. Most of you, if you're Confluence experts, you probably already knew that. But what most of you may not know is that comments and likes, which happen early on in a piece of content's lifecycle, have a disproportionate effect on that ranking algorithm. And what that means is the first responders who receive emails immediately into their inbox, they have a huge effect on new content cycling in, replacing old content. They effectively control what gets promoted into the popular list of Confluence's dashboard. And once something makes it into the popular dashboard, then the rest of the company simply has to check the popular dashboard once a day. So that's one of the ways that they scale Confluence. The second way is through something that I call dot connecting. These first responders who receive all these emails and skim read all these blog posts, they're uniquely well informed across the company. So they sort of act as this backup mechanism. They see something, and they're likely to connect a person who needs it with that piece of content. And they do that just by sharing it via Confluence, as I've shown before, or they do it by app mentioning to drag them in. You know, hey, can we reuse this same work for our front end? What do you think, Ellie? Do you think that we could maybe use that? If I hadn't done that, then maybe Ellie would have gone off and built her own thing. And that's the final piece of the magic that causes Confluence to scale using blog posts. All right, we've covered a lot of ground here. So let's put all of that together. In Confluence, knowledge is preserved, and it's easy to opt out, and you're always looped in. Those are key benefits over email. But once you introduce Confluence, you now have a new problem. Your Confluence is going to end up messy because work is fundamentally messy. So instead of trying to win that battle, you should apply 3 key tactics to hold the chaos at bay within a space. You should update your space homepage to make it good, and you should rephrase the principle of most privilege and fix what is broken using your organization's values. But to unlock the true power of Confluence and use it as Atlassian uses it, to get your teams to talk to each other, you need to use Confluence blog posts. So here's your 4-step plan to adopting blog posts. Step 1 is to write your intro blog. It's going to be a reference for other people, so make it a pretty good one. Step 2 is to write a Summit wrap blog. A Summit wrap blog is all about making it easy. It is all about talking about what was the most high-impact talks at Summit. Obviously, this talk is going to be one of the most high-impact talks at Summit, so you should definitely talk about my talk. So it's a perfect opportunity to talk about how important blogs are in the use of Confluence. So this is going to get the blogging train started at your company. The next step is to update your onboarding material. Make your new hires write their intro blog post and have them subscribe to all blogs. You need to build that core of first responders, and your new hires are a good place to start. Remember to follow up with them because they have a lot on their minds in their first couple of days. And the final step is remember to write and share blogs instead of emailing. Next time you need to write an announcement, do it as a blog rather than as an email. And remember to gently correct people when they revert to email. Now, if you follow these 4 steps successfully, then you will eventually change the culture of your team, your department, and your entire organization. And that's how you'll win friends and Confluence people. Thank you. I now have, I think, 50 seconds to take probably one question about best practices for Confluence.
Yep.
So on average, how long are blog posts written by people at Atlassian? Are they short and sweet? Are they really long? Or
Yeah. Okay, so the question was how long are blog posts on average when they're written by Atlassians? The answer is it varies a lot. I think probably the shortest useful blog post is about 2 paragraphs. Normally there needs to be a little bit of context given, but to make sure that people who are not aware of what's going on in that particular space or team can understand what's happening. And then the second paragraph would be the actual thing that you're trying to explain or announce or whatever. But I've also seen really long ones with lots of technical information in there. That can also work. Yeah. So really, it depends on the circumstance. That's it. If you have further questions, then you can come and find me in the status page booth, or you can find me immediately afterwards. Remember, I'm in the status page booth. I'm not in the Confluence booth. We are next to each other, same like the booths are next to each other, but just look for the beard. And if you take one thing away from today, is that you should write Confluence blog posts. Thank you.